Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company, a nationally ranked community-focused bank with over 30 locations throughout Virginia, Northeast Tennessee, and North Carolina. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more.
What's up, Hokie Nation, and welcome into episode 386 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Basketball season is here in Blacksburg, and we got the whole basketball crew on set to break it down. Episode 386 of the Tech Sideline podcast starts right now. We're recording on Tuesday, October 29th, 2024 from the Tech Sideline High-Tech Studios in Blacksburg, Virginia. Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company, where exceptional customer service comes first. They offer a variety of checking and savings account options that are sure to meet your banking needs, including free checking. Visit firstbank.com to find the account that's right for you. I'm your host, Carter Hill. To my right is lead analyst and columnist Chris Coleman. Across the way is our managing editor, David Cunningham. Nick Brown, our director of media, is producing behind the scenes, and we are so fired up to talk some hoops. Guys, believe it or not, basketball season is here. We've been pushing off this podcast for a couple of weeks, but now that Halloween is here and we're 6 days away, it kind of feels like we're ready to get into a rhythm a little bit on the hardwood.
Yeah, I think so. It's actually, to get technical about it, it's crossover season. Because
Yes.
it's still football season as well. So yeah, it's a lot to cover, a lot to go over, but it'll be good to see the Hokies get out on the court and get started.
It's our busiest time of the year, specifically for me. It's
Yes.
my busiest time of the year. Am I ready for it? I think so. It's going to be different this year. Virginia Tech is not going to go to the Final Four or win the ACC in women's basketball. I think we were spoiled a little bit the last couple of years. It's going to be interesting to see how Megan Duffy kind of rebuilds and takes over and retools this women's basketball program. And then on the men's side, the roster obviously looks completely different. And it's been a while since they made the NCAA tournament. So can they get back there? That's the real question. But might look a little bit different this year than it has in the years past, just because the women have been so good these last 2 years and been quite the wave. It's been really, really fun. I'm excited to see the fan support next Monday night for that doubleheader. The women host at 5, the men at 8. Should be good. Excited the basketball season's here and gives us something different to talk about. We'll see how these seasons unfold. I'm very, very interested.
So let's talk about that. We're going to break down the men and the women, but talking about the men's side of things. This past offseason was pretty eye-opening for Mike Young and company. I mean, you lose pretty much your entire team, whether it be the portal or to graduation. Your entire starting five, gone. Most of your rotation, gone. This is literally a completely new team. And I get that's part of the transfer portal era, but in a key year where it feels like Virginia Tech needs to get back to the NCAA tournament, Tech is relying on a lot of unknowns to get back to the big dance.
Yeah, I think last year's team lacked chemistry.
Yeah.
And when you lack chemistry, you have to identify why you lacked chemistry. And some of those guys are going to have to move on. And I'm not saying that's why they moved on per se, but I'm not 100% convinced that Mike Young put up a huge fight to keep some of them. I think he recognized that things needed to change. Maybe I would have preferred maybe not quite this much change, but at the same time, if your goal is to make the NCAA tournament, then sometimes you kind of do need to rip it up and start over. So this is an entirely different roster. We don't know exactly what to expect from them. That's kind of the fun part, though, to a certain extent. You just don't know a lot about these dudes, and you'll probably have some pleasant surprises. You might have a couple of unpleasant disappointments, too. That's just part of it.
Yeah, I think there have been a couple curveballs thrown Mike Young's way in terms of roster. I mean, there are 2 transfer guards, one that committed to the Hokies and then went somewhere else, and another that enrolled practiced. We talked to him at media day, and is now gone. Right, like this is a weird era where kids are coming and going and whatnot. And what Mike Young has to do now is he has to do what a lot of coaches have backed out of college basketball for, right? Tony Bennett just left at Virginia. Mike Young, a guy who has been around for a really long time in college basketball, and his programs were kind of prided on developing and staying for a while. Probably a little weird for him to have to kind of pull guys left and right and try to kind of make stuff from scratch at the beginning of every single season, or at least this season. Like you said, Carter, a lot of unknowns. There's talent there. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there are a lot of good players on this team, but Mike Young and the players, they're figuring out how in the world they mesh together. I think Tech has a pretty good starting five figured out right now, but everything else is up in the air, and even that's kind of in question. So it's going to be interesting to just see how everything unfolds and like watch it in action, because in the past Mike Young has kind of like had a good feel for, hey, these are the guys I've been able to rely on. This is kind of my core. There were times where in the past Virginia Tech fans were upset that certain guards were not coming off the floor and they were still starting, right? Mike Young likes consistency in his lineups. Are we going to see that this year? Because I don't know if he knows what to expect from these guys night in, night out. It's kind of up in the air overall.
I don't think he does, and how could you? I mean, in the most recent scrimmage, without going into great detail, because we don't have all the detail, but they used 10 different rotations in the last scrimmage.
Mm-hmm.
So he's still trying to get a feel for who plays well together, who doesn't play well together, and it takes a while. It takes longer than just the preseason to figure that out, especially when you're only playing 2 scrimmages.
Sure, there is literally a question mark everywhere on the roster right now, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I do want to break down the transfers. There are now 5 transfers coming in. There were originally 6. And if you want a full breakdown of the Hyseer Miller situation, click here on YouTube, and then on any of the audio platforms in which you get your podcasts, you can find out what happened to Hyseer Miller with something we recorded on Friday. But breaking down the roster and the transfers, Toby Lawal comes in from VCU, Jaden Shue comes in from Duke, Rodney Brown Jr. from Cal, Ben Burnham from College of Charleston, and Connor Servin from Eastern Michigan. What intrigues you most about this group, David, and how those 5 are going to mesh together as a whole?
I think Shute has the potential to be a really, really, really high scorer. I mean, he's a sharpshooter. He's a guy who's been injured. There's a reason he was at Duke, and Michigan State recruited him as well. I mean, if you're talking about, Shire and Kay, and then Izzo, I mean, that's the type of level player he could be for Virginia Tech. It's kind of just whether he can get there and stay healthy. Toby Lawal is a freak in terms of athleticism. Like, we're talking like Deron Washington. That's going to be exciting. I'm so excited to watch him in action and high-flying dunk. He blocks a lot of shots. I think those 2 guys, and the Wall, I mean, those 2 guys have extra years of eligibility too. So it's not like they're just a one-time thing. Ben Burnham's a guy with experience, kind of a Swiss Army knife from College of Charleston. He's a guy who I think will take more of a veteran role, be a kind of a leader in that locker room. He kind of came down to Charlotte, ACC tip-off with Elijah Poteet, so you're kind of already seeing that a little bit. Rodney Brown Jr. is an interesting one for me. He's probably going to be that 3rd or 4th guy on that wing. He's got a couple of years of eligibility, though. He only played 1. So It's like he's got time to kind of learn and grow and develop. So this is a kind of a transfer group that has its pros, has its cons. The bummer is that you had a point guard too in Miller, and I think he probably was the most integral piece in terms of the transfer pickups, and now he's gone.
Yeah, I think when I look at let's combine a couple of the returning players in there. Rex Steiner's going to start at point guard. He's a sophomore. Schute's going to start off the ball, and he's a sophomore. Jaden Young's going to start off the ball, and he's a sophomore. If those guys play reasonably well this year, then you're sitting here thinking, okay, we've got a trio of 3-year starters that are all going to be starting, or they could
and a
all
nice
be
core
starting next
going
week.
forward too.
Right, exactly. That's the positive. The negative is all 3 of those guys are sophomores and they've never played together. We don't know what that's going to look like yet.
Yeah.
But in theory, it's something that could work longer term. I agree with David. I'll be interested to see what Toby Lawal looks like. He some people had been clamoring for an athleticism upgrade on this team.
There you go.
Here's your athleticism upgrade. This guy is a big time athlete, like an elite level athlete. Is he skilled enough to play effectively offensively in the Mike Young system, though? If he's out there at the same time with Elijah Poteet, and teams can kind of compress their defense a little more because of that, because neither one of those guys is really a shooter or a creator, does it actually help Virginia Tech? Does it become a net positive? I think it helps them on the defensive end. How much it helps them on the offensive end, we don't know yet. But again, it's just another example of there's so many different new pieces on this team that it's a puzzle, and you've just got to try to put it together.
Yeah, it's crazy to think back to like a couple of years ago. Like think about the 2022 ACC championship team for Virginia Tech. That was a pretty simple group, right? You knew who your 5 were, Storm Murphy, Hunter Couture, Naheem Aline, Justin Mutz, and Keve Luma. And you had
2 or 3 off the bench.
Sean Padula and David Gasson off the bench, and that was kind of it. Darius Maddox. Right, yeah. All right, so that was the 8, right? And you kind of knew that was the starting 5, and you knew who was going to come in, right? This year, it's like, I think Poteet's going to start. And I mean, you have a good idea, I think, of who's going to start, obviously. You just said, I think Lawal will probably, he might start at the 4 and Poteet at the 5. But Mike Young knew that year, because he had so many guys coming back, of what his rotation was going to look like. He has no idea what this is going to look like.
Yeah.
And I mean, as far as like offensive situations versus defensive situations, who plays better together offensively versus defensively? When 3-point shots aren't fun, like different ways to get guys looks, who plays well together in terms of nightmare matchups for the defense, right? Like there's just so much he has not had a chance to, I think, unravel yet. And you'll see that as the season goes along. There might be a couple times where he just you see the light on the floor just come on for a certain group, and they just kind of hit on all cylinders. So I'm like, expectations should obviously be tempered, because this group is, I mean, there are so many unknowns, and they haven't played they haven't played together. And I think in terms of talent, they're probably towards the bottom of the ACC, especially with Miller gone. But if they can kind of hit on some things, don't count out the possibility that Tech, gets on a run of success this year.
It's not the talent level that bothers me.
Yeah.
It's the lack of experience together.
I agree.
For a Mike Young system.
I agree.
Yeah.
But Mike Young's a good coach, and he will get the best out of his players. And I think that's the important thing. It's more so just, when do those guys come together?
Mm-hmm.
Mike Young told me at ACC Tip-Off that Toby Lawal is the first guy he's ever coached that he had to ask to wear a mouthpiece because he's concerned he's going to hit his face on the rim. True story.
Wow.
So there's your teaser. Jaden Schutt, to your point, if he's healthy, he could be a dude for Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
I also think Ben Burnham could be a very nice fit in the system that Mike Young runs as a whole.
I agree. I think Lawal is going to be fantastic, and he's got a high basketball IQ. Just talking to him at Media Day a couple weeks ago, he obviously, J.D. Byers, the assistant, was the connection there from VCU, former VCU assistant. Lawal, you could see him process the game. And I think that is very unique, because he's got eligibility left after this year. Like, he's going to be a guy that could wreak havoc on the ACC next year, right? Like, when he has a year in Mike Young's system and understands where he's supposed to be. I think Schutt is a great fit. It just kind of, can he stay healthy? And honestly, for him, I feel like it's more of a matter of, do the shots go in or not? Then you got Ben Burnham, and I think he's an interesting one because he's got the kind of the versatility to play the 3 and the 4. He's more of a 4, obviously, but he's a guy who you kind of know what you're going to get from him. I feel like he rebounds well, he can score. Can he kind of fill in those gaps that Virginia Tech might have? That's kind of what I'm looking at from those 3.
Yeah, I look at that front court and, like, what are the combinations? Like, can you play Toby Lawal and Malijah Petit together a lot? How much does that maybe limit you with your outside shooting on offense? But how much does it make you better on defense? So what's the balance? Is it better to play Toby Lawal with a Wessler or Ryan Jones at center? And is it better to play Malijah Petit with, say, a Ben Burnham at the 4? Because you're trying to get a good mix out there. You don't want to limit yourself on either side of on either end of the court. But to your point about shoot, I think he's going to lead Tech in scoring this year. That's my gut feel if he stays healthy.
Chris, you were talking about defensively, and again, we really talked about Heister Miller on Friday. Heister Miller was supposed to be a guy coming in that was going to improve Virginia Tech defensively. How confident are you in Tech's ability to be better in that area this year with Miller no longer on the roster?
Not confident. The preseason, his 2 scrimmages, Mike Young's not too happy, we've heard, with his defense after the first 2 scrimmages. And it's not necessarily, we need to get better on the ball and things like that. It's cohesive team defense, because Virginia Tech runs a defensive system as well, just like they run an offensive system. And it's about the help and the timing of the help and, how guarding ball screens and things like that. They're all these guys coming from different backgrounds. They handle things like, how do you guard the ball screen? And they're all coming from different programs, and they've all done it different ways in the past. And now you have to plug all that together. I'm confident Virginia Tech will be a better basketball team in February than they are right now. How long will it take them to get to that point? However, that's the concern.
Yeah, I agree. You remember in the preseason when Mike Young talked about how he's been coaching some of the fundamentals more than he's ever coached before.
Yeah.
That's kind of what this is. Virginia Tech's defense, it needs to be good this year.
Yeah.
Like, Tech has to be good on the defensive end. I think Lawal is kind of a guy who will help that. Miller's on-ball presence was going to be huge. Offensively, he was a guy who, yes, took a lot of shots at Temple and, yes, can score the ball. And I think more than anything had experience at point guard. But this is a guy who defensively you could kind of task him for maybe 30 minutes of a 40-minute game in guarding the other team's point guard. And I just think about some of these matchups Virginia Tech is going to face just in the ACC. Chase Hunter from Clemson, RJ Davis from North Carolina, Tyrese Proctor from Duke. There are so many good point guards. And I look at this duo in Brandon Rexsteiner and Ben Hammond. Yes, they're talented, but they're so inexperienced. And I mean, I remember last 2 years, we saw times where Champagula really struggled in terms of defense, right? He obviously was very, very good a lot of the time offensively, but I can picture in
Auburn.
Yeah, I mean, I can picture in my mind, like, Kihei Clark blowing right by him.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, they're just, you can't turn that switch off. And Virginia Tech needed a point guard that was going to be on defensively all the time. And I think that was what Miller was the hope. I think Tech can be decent defensively, but, man, there's a lot of work to do. And that's another thing. Mike has to figure out offensively who fits well together, but same thing goes defensively. Who kind of works well together, right? If you've got a guy like Tyler Johnson, he's a really, really good rebounder and a really good defender from what we've heard. I think he's going to play a lot for Virginia Tech this year as a true freshman. That's a name you need to know if you're a Virginia Tech fan. Like, where does he fit in? Where is he comfortable? Do you feel comfortable with him guarding the 4, right? You are who you can guard, as Mike Young says. So there's a lot still to be worked out. Like, that's what I'm going to be looking out for on Monday when Virginia Tech plays Delaware State. What do the Hokies look like defensively?
Yeah.
I know it's only Delaware State, but who looks comfortable.
How many open looks does Delaware State get?
Correct.
Because, you know, they're not a good basketball team. So, you know, they could shoot a low percentage and not score many points, and that's not necessarily reflective of how the game goes and how Virginia Tech actually guards. I think you can break it down defensively fairly simply. Like, Hunter Couture was an elite defender. And even with him on the court, Virginia Tech still struggled with team defense last year. Like, what did they finish in defensive efficiency in the Pomeroy? It was in the 90s.
Yeah.
And the
in
year
the
before,
90s, it was
year before that, it was in the hundreds.
Yeah, I think it was like in the 110s.
Right. All of Mike Young's NCAA tournament teams in his career have been top 60 in defensive efficiency, correct?
That's correct.
So Virginia Tech is going to have to improve about 30 to 40 spots defensively while also losing their best defensive player. I mean, Couture was their best team defender. He was their best on-ball defender. He was pretty much their best everything defender. And I think when you look, and there's, you know, there's a possibility that Lawal and Petit will start together. Even that doesn't make sense on the offensive end to me. But if he feels like that's his best defensive lineup, then that could be a reason why those two guys are starting together. Ultimately, and I wanted to see Virginia Tech get more athletic. You know, I liked the additions of Lawal, and I liked the addition of Miller before we found out he was doing what he was alleged to be doing. I thought those guys would make Virginia Tech better defensively. I didn't think the Hokies would be as good offensively this year, but I also trusted Mike Young, his X's and O's offensive ability to coax the most out of that group as you possibly can on the offensive end. So I wanted him to get a little bit more defensive focus, but you know, now losing Miller, you know, part of that is gone. So how do you get better without your best defender? And like the perimeter defense is pretty concerning.
So here's something that concerns me, and this is not just related to Virginia Tech, but in the transfer portal era, when you're bringing in essentially a new team, it's obviously going to take some time to gel. But in today's day and age, with the net and the metrics, teams and conferences are judged based on the non-conference. So that is a big concern for me. Like, it may take this team some time, and if they don't figure it out until January, the perception is already out there.
You're right. And you look at the net every year, and the ACC always seems to do better in the NCAA tournament than the net rankings would indicate. And you see all the ACC analysts, you know, they were down there at ACC Media Day talking about it. Like, why does this conference not get as much respect when they're doing this in March, and they don't get as many teams in the NCAA tournament as other conferences? Well, the last 4 or 5 years, the ACC has a bad history of really stinking in non-conference play.
Yeah.
Like they have had some bad losses and some blowout losses too. And then, they get better and they play better in March, and the teams that make it to the NCAA tournament do better. But they have to do better in these non-conference games. If they do better in these non-conference games, they would get more teams in the NCAA tournament. So, I mean, that's on the ACC for not starting the season as well. And but to your point, I mean, it's important because, I mean, every game counts when you're talking about computer metrics. It's not like you know, you're fighting to go to the conference title game, and where theoretically speaking you can go 2-2 in non-conference play, but then if you go 7-1 in conference play, you're still probably going to Charlotte, right? It's entirely different. If your goal was to make the NCAA tournament, you need to be able to play consistent basketball all season, and that probably will be difficult for Virginia Tech this year.
I mean, in terms of non-conference schedule, we will know what the Hokies have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've got a game against Penn State on a neutral floor in Baltimore. They've got Vanderbilt here in the SEC ACC Challenge. They've got some good competition down in Fort Myers in that tournament over Thanksgiving. I mean, there are some pretty good teams that they're playing. Like, I think we will have a good gauge of where they are. But it's also one of those things, it's like, you can't really afford to drop many games, if any at all, with the ACC playing, not to get you to go on a rant, a 20-game conference schedule.
Oh gosh.
like it you know, if you're playing 20 games, that means you've really only got 10 or 11 in the non-conference. You got to win 9-ish to feel comfortable. So it's going to be tough, but we're going to know, I think, probably around Thanksgiving, you know, what this team is made of when they play some pretty good competition. Luckily, they don't, you know, they, unlike the women, who we'll talk about later, the women have Iowa second game of the year, right? That's a little bit more difficult. But it's going to be something to keep your eye on, just kind of how this group meshes together. And again, I'm looking at the defense these first couple games of like, do they look comfortable and confident? It's like, if they're playing a better team, how do I see this going, kind of thing.
And remind me, they're playing Virginia, Miami, and Clemson twice this year. Everybody else once.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, it is strange how they're doing it now, particularly on the women's side. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
So Tech opens ACC play, I believe, the men against Pitt at home, like first weekend in December, right after
the 7th or 8th or something.
Yeah,
like
right
that.
after that Vanderbilt game.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And Tech's second ACC game is on the road in Cameron Indoor on New Year's Eve. Like, those are two NCAA tournament teams from last year. Or Pitt got snubbed, but like,
had the talent too.
those are two teams. Like, Virginia Tech does not start off ACC play easy. I'll just put it that way. That's a tough way to start conference play.
And then Miami at home.
Yeah.
Miami still has the guard.
Nigel Pack.
You know, they also have down low.
Yeah, some dude named Kid. Yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of put a bow on the men's basketball conversation, Chris, you've used this example time in and time out. David, you did in Charlotte too. Florida State football. So if these guys cash in, it could be a surprising fun year in Blacksburg.
Sure.
If it doesn't work out, quite frankly, it could be not what we've seen the past couple of years. How do you view the Florida State situation versus what Virginia Tech is currently doing, and how much could that potentially come into play, do you think?
Well, Florida State football, they have a lot more money, relatively speaking. I mean, of course, any football program generally is going to have more NIL money than basketball because there's simply more players. But relative to the competition, like Florida State is, they're probably not Miami in NIL, but they're probably second or third probably in the ACC in NIL money. And they've got a lot of resources relative to the rest of the conference. Whereas Virginia Tech basketball is near the bottom, we've heard, in the ACC in basketball revenue. So his choices are more limited than everyone else. When it comes to what players you can take. Like, I don't know that Hyseer Miller was his number one choice at point guard. There was one kid who, I forget where he came from, and he went to Northwestern that I think might have been the number one choice. But maybe if you have an extra $200,000 in an NIL budget, you have that. But I mean, that's just like Tech is throwing all their NIL to football. Like, they've got one football player that I think makes as much or more than the entire basketball team, right? So that's going to limit Mike Young's recruiting options in the portal. And that's something that we'll have to change in the future. Whether Mike, I know there's some people that want to change basketball coaches right now at Virginia Tech. There are a few people that want to do that. I would warn those people that unless Tech's NIL budget changes in basketball, then the results aren't going to change.
So much you can do.
Exactly.
Yeah. And to your point, I think they will get the best out of this group. Now, what is that limit? We'll see. The big question, to wrap it up on the men's side, without Hyseer Miller, do you guys see any avenue to get to the NCAA tournament? Like, is there a path for the Hokies to go to March?
Things would have to gel perfectly.
Yeah.
Perfectly. And no injuries.
Yeah. I mean, Tech, think about last year, right? Virginia Tech, it felt like there was somebody injured every single game. The entire second half of the season, I'm blanking on his name. I don't know why. Mekhi Long. Yes, thank you. I was going to say ODU transfer.
Yeah.
He was injured for the entire second half of the season, right? Brandon Rexsteiner was banged up. MJ Collins was banged up a couple times. Hunter Couture was out a game because of what appeared to be a concussion, right? Shampadula. It's like, I think the only player who played in every single game last year was Robbie Barron. Mm-hmm. So it's like, if Carter, if Tech is going to have any chance at making the NCAA tournament this year, things are going to have to go the right way. Yeah. Meaning, like, guys can't, you got to stay healthy. You're gonna have to get lucky, right? You're probably gonna have to, like, man, it'd be great. Virginia Tech would get super lucky if hosts Miami and Nigel Pack is out sick or something like that, right?
If they get some of the luck the football team's having with backup quarterbacks.
Yeah,
Correct,
And
right?
if the ball bounces their way a little bit more on the injury front compared to last year, where Hunter Couture missed the Miami game
if you think about last year, they went 10-10 in the ACC.
Yeah.
And they were probably 2 games away for making the NCAA
They
tournament.
lost twice to Florida, or they lost twice to Miami.
Right, exactly.
Oh, true,
Right.
yeah.
So despite the injuries that they had, and despite the, in my opinion, lack of chemistry on that team, they were still fairly close to being an NCAA tournament team, which I think is probably a testament to how good of an offensive coach Mike Young is. But things are going to have to go perfect on that front this year for them to get in.
Yeah, I think, before the season, like in the preseason poll, before the Miller stuff, I picked Tech about 11th in the ACC. I'd probably put Tech about 14th, 15th, right there on that edge. And I think because there's so much unknown. That's not saying Tech can't do something, but it's going to be an uphill battle in a conference that I think is better than a lot of people would nationally give it credit for. Mike Young's a good coach, and he usually gets the best out of his players and kind of squeezes the orange and gets everything out of it, right? This team is going to be competitive, and I could see this team winning 8-9 ACC games. It's just it feels like it's going to be a big uphill climb, especially considering less than 2 weeks before the season, the guy who's supposed to be your starting point guard is no longer on the team.
Yeah.
So
To Nick's point, women's soccer was picked 12th this year in the ACC preseason poll, and they may finish second.
that's true. That's a good point.
We'll see.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the women. Megan Duffy is the new head coach here at Virginia Tech, and this team obviously will look very different. And I'm careful when I say she retained a core because Georgia Amor, Liz Kitley, Kayla King obviously are all gone. But Karis Baker, Matilda Eck, Carly Wenzel, Rose Mishaw do stick around. David, how key is that for Megan Duffy in year one to at least retain that group and kind of help with this transition going forward?
It's big. And this is a talented group, too.
Yeah.
5 of the 6 kids who stayed are former top 100 recruits, according to ESPN. The one who's not is Matilda Eck, and it's because she's from Sweden.
The
right?
Swedish sensation.
Yeah. So I think this is an opportunity for Megan Duffy to hit the ground running immediately. We've already seen the Hokies do pretty well on the recruiting trail. She's got 2 top 100 commits and another 4-star for next year's recruiting class. The Hokies are indoors that they need to be. Can they? What does it look like on the court? And I think having all these talented kids back, kids who know Virginia Tech, understand what it's like to play at Virginia Tech. They get the school, they get the fans, they get everything about this place. I think that's important. You can't buy that. And a lot of those players, they have pretty good experience. I mean, you're talking about Matilda Eck, who was Tech's third leading scorer last season behind Elizabeth Kitley and Georgia Amor. I expect Matilda Eck to have the ball even more this year and be even better. Rose Mishaw is somebody who was kind of playing a little bit out of position. She's a traditional 5. She's not obviously a 6'6" like Kitley, so she slid down to the 4 last year and didn't play very well. But she averaged almost 15 or 16 points when she played in that role at Minnesota 2 years ago. Can she kind of get back to that form where she's very energetic and very physical, and she's a force down there? I think that is the biggest question. Tech's front court depth, there's not much.
Yeah.
But with the core you have back, Carly Wenzel, Karis Baker, Mackenzie Nelson, Samaya Suffren, like those kids, they are very, very, very talented. I'm curious to just kind of see how it all gels together in terms of you only bring in 1 transfer. That's Lonnie White from Utah. She started the exhibition last week against Limestone. And then the 1 freshman I'm looking at, there are a couple, but Kale Peterson,
Yep.
She looked awfully good in that exhibition. So how does it kind of come together, and when you play a better team, how does that style kind of translate? What does it look like?
To me, I guess the most interesting thing is the change in tempo.
Yep.
They were slow tempo under Kenny Brooks, as they probably should have been when you've got your best player is Liz Kitley, and she's playing 36 to 38 minutes a game, and you can't play it at a fast tempo like that when your best player's playing that many minutes, and she's a center. I don't believe. I think this team is probably more suited to it. I think Wenzel in particular is suited to play an up-tempo style. I think she was maybe sometimes held back a little bit by the tempo last year, although for the team as a whole, I think it was the right thing to do. But it's just going to be a different brand of basketball in the future. And, much like the men's team, there's a lot of unknown, and we just don't know what to expect. How quickly they adapt to the returning players, adapt to this style of play. And so many of these players haven't played together before, and how quick does the gelling process take? Like the men's team, I think they'll be a better team in February than they are at the beginning of the season, but how long does it take to get to that point?
Yeah, they're going to push the pace. There's no doubt about that. And they are undersized. I think that's a big thing too. But to your point about the style of play, that is a system that I think somebody like a Carly Wenzel can thrive in, to your point, Chris. And if she can do that, you do have some talent still on the wings for sure.
I think Mackenzie Nelson and Samaya Suffren are going to thrive too. And Megan Duffy talked about this a little bit last week. How Suffren and Nelson come along will kind of determine where Wenzel plays, because Wenzel's kind of their number one option at point guard right now. But if Duffy feels comfortable with Nelson and Suffren handling things at the point, she can kind of move Wenzel off ball, where she really, Duffy really likes Wenzel in that role. So I think this group will thrive in the up tempo. I think honestly Mackenzie Nelson's kind of said it last week. I honestly think that might be Tech's biggest strength this year, just being able to push the ball, get out in transition. It's going to be much different from a viewing perspective of, oh my gosh, Virginia Tech is getting up and running down the floor, but it's fun. We kind of saw a little glimpse of that against Limestone. Like it's fun, it's enjoyable, and that leads to a lot of, in some ways, easy opportunities, getting out and pushing. And I thought Nelson and Suffren were both terrific, really, really good flashes in transition, pushing the pace. I thought Wenzel was pretty good too. What does it look like against an ACC caliber team, though? That's my biggest question, right? When you host Notre Dame and you're playing against, two All-American point guards in Hannah Hidalgo and Olivia Miles, which is ridiculous that they're sharing the same backcourt together this year. There are going to be games where Tech is going to be, I think, outmanned a little bit.
Yeah, they were picked 12th in the ACC, but I think that's more of a reflection on the league than Virginia Tech. I don't think it's a knock on the Hokies. I just think it's more so the ACC is one of the better conferences in the country. I think it's the best. Kenny Brooks changed his opinion when he went to Kentucky, which is fair. I understand. No, but all jokes aside, I think it's more of a reflection on the ACC.
Oh, absolutely. The ACC is really, really good. Like Notre Dame and NC State are both going to be absolute wagons this year. Don't sleep on Virginia. Virginia's going to be much better. Duke, Carolina are both going to be up there. Florida State, Louisville.
Syracuse was good last year, right?
Syracuse, I think, will probably take a step back just a tad because lost the leading scorer, Deasia Fair, top 5 all time in NCAA scoring. Stanford joins the conference, and Stanford's really good. Yes, Carter, this is, in my opinion, the best, top to bottom, I would say, the best conference. The tough part is South Carolina and LSU have won the last couple national championships.
Yes.
Yeah, you could say like the ACC maybe has more depth.
Yeah,
the SEC is a little more top heavy.
Yeah.
But you could probably make an argument for 10 to 12 teams in the ACC being able to make the NCAA tournament. Now, not that many will make it, but you can make the argument that they could.
Yeah. This is going to be an interesting year for the ACC. I am super high on Notre Dame. I think that team's going to be really good. Same with NC State. And one of the reasons, in terms of talking Virginia Tech, that's going to be so tough at times for this team. 3 of their first 4 ACC games are on the road, and they've got a like a 9-game stretch in the middle of the season where 7 of those games are against Notre Dame, NC State, Louisville, Virginia, North Carolina, Syracuse. And it's like, you know, I think Virginia Tech fans maybe took a little bit for granted these last 2 years when Hokies had similar stretches like that at the end of the year. I mean, you think back to last year, Virginia Tech went on the road 4 straight Sundays and won, like, at Syracuse, at Louisville, at, you know, home against North Carolina. Like, they were steamrolling really, really good teams. This Virginia Tech team, when it gets into the heat, the heart of the schedule, ACC play, you know, games 9, 10, 11, and that middle, what does it look like? Because that is kind of going to be the defining moment of this season, in my opinion.
So how deep are they going to go? You were talking about the depth issues, but you look at the starting 5. Obviously, it's not what they've had, but it is a good group. The starting 5 is a good group. You have Mackenzie Nelson, Samaya Suffren off the bench, probably Cale Peterson as well. Maybe Layla Wells. Do they maybe go 9, or how deep do you think they go?
I think they probably go 9, maybe even 10 with Maya Hazelton, depending on the situation. Again, this is going to be a group that is going to be pretty undersized in some battles. So that's why, like, there are going to be some ACC games stylistically that fit the Hokies better than others. When they play a scrappy Boston College team, that might fare a little bit better than playing an NC State team, though, you know, the Wolfpack this year might run an all-guard lineup, as we kind of talked about at AC Media Day. I think that the clash of styles is going to be more important to this Virginia Tech team than ever, because if you play a team that struggles in transition, that you can force a lot of turnovers on, I think you're going to have a good opportunity to win. I
think, there's not a lot of upperclassmen on this team, but that's why I think it's critical that you get consistent play from those upperclassmen. Like, if I looked at it on paper, I'd probably say Matilda Eck would probably lead the team in scoring this year, you would think. She had some games where, she was scoring 18 a game at times last year. She also had a streak where she was scoring 0 in games, right? So it's very important to have a lot fewer of those 0 games this year, because if Virginia Tech wants to exceed expectations, they'll need, a consistent 14, 15 from her every night, I think.
And that's a good point. Where does the scoring come from?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Same thing for the men, but yeah, I mean, Eck last year, I believe it was like from the Notre Dame game until the first round of the NCAA tournament game. So
it was like 3 or 4 games,
like
wasn't it?
Notre Dame, UVA, and the 2 or 3 ACC tournament game. I mean, it was a 4 or 5 game stretch where Eck didn't score. I mean, I think Eck will probably lead the Hokies in scoring. Rose Mishaw needs to contribute. I'm very excited to watch Cale Peterson. But then there's that other group. I think Karis Baker could be a real difference maker for this team this year. Carter, you asked about how deep. I think Lila Wells, we saw her play pretty good defense. I think that is going to be the deciding factor as to kind of who plays for the Hokies this year. Can they play good defense? Because that's what Megan Duffy, prides herself on and this team on. I think this will be a pretty good defensive team, but I'd also like to see them play like that against better competition before I make any further judgments.
Yeah, I think they do need to be better on the defensive end. Whenever, on the rare occasions they lost the last couple of years, it was generally in a game where they got outscored.
Yeah.
Right. If they could have just bared down a little bit more on defense, they could have won a few more games. So you like to see them keep a few more teams in the 60s this year. That'll give them a better chance to win.
Scoring should be more balanced this year. I think that's definitely fair to say too. Scoring should absolutely be more balanced. So what would your goal be if you're Megan Duffy in year 1? Is it the NCAA tournament? Obviously you want to go to the big dance, but is that your end goal? Can you get to the NCAA tournament? How much progress do you want to see in year 1?
I think if Virginia Tech, think about this now, it's an 18-team conference and a 15-team tournament, ACC tournament. Not everybody makes it, which is something to keep an eye on, unfortunately, for both Virginia Tech basketball teams this year, which is crazy to think about.
That'd give you an easy month of August if they didn't make it. Easier.
Yeah.
Less work.
David's like,
But
I
that would
don't
be
get it.
unfortunate. You don't get 2 trips to Greensboro. Or are they in Greensboro?
Yeah,
this year?
Greensboro and
Greensboro and
Charlotte this
Charlotte.
year. Yeah, that'd be an interesting.
David's year's done on March 8th, and he's like, I'm going to the West Coast with my buddies.
Taking 3 months off.
Yeah. I think a successful season for the women's team. You play 18 games, unlike the men who play 20. If you can, I think 7 ACC wins would be a good mark. I think a single bye in the ACC tournament, so finishing in the top half of the conference,
I agree.
that would be, I think, overachieving. I think that would be great. I expect Tech to be playing on that first day in Greensboro, finishing anywhere from like 10th to 13th is probably successful. Making the WNIT or WBIT, whatever.
Yeah, I think they just changed it. Yeah.
Whatever the tournament's called now, it's whatever. I don't expect this to be an NCAA tournament team, but Megan Duffy's also building, and I think the future looks really, really bright. When you look at this roster, so many players are going to be here for multiple years. That is a solid building block, and I think what Virginia Tech fans just want to see is progress.
Mm-hmm.
You know what this fan base can do. This fan base sold out a ton of games these last couple of years, and I think as Megan Duffy builds up this program, you will see the program kind of improve. It's gonna be tough to get back to being the top dog in the ACC, but I don't think. I mean, the way this is going, I could see Virginia Tech being this is an NCAA tournament team next year, like no question about it. So that's what you kind of have to keep building towards. And I think showing improvement this year, showing that you can win some big games. I don't know how many they're going to take from the best teams in the ACC, but I think 6-7 wins going to the postseason, maybe winning an ACC tournament game, like that is the stuff that kind of gets the ball rolling for future years. Yeah.
To piggyback off what he said, results aside, I think when you get to the end of the season, you want to see a couple things. You want to see buy-in. You want to look back and say, yeah, they bought into the culture, they bought into the scheme. They're all on board from that standpoint. And you want to be able to say, okay, yeah, our young players did well enough to this year where we feel like we have a good core and a good future. So, your Carly Wenzels, your Mackenzie Nelsons, et cetera, et cetera. If you can say those two things at the end of the season, then I would call that a successful first year.
And it does feel like, again, obviously very different situation compared to the men, but it feels like talking to them the other day at their mini media day, if you will, was it Mackenzie Nelson who said the team chemistry was A+++++.
Yes.
So it seems like they're on the right track. I think this coaching staff, especially with the ACC connections too, is really going to do a nice job. As Kelly Gramlich said, though, at ACC tip-off, it just takes time. And part of being a fan is going through the peaks and valleys of maybe what the women's program is about to go through.
Yeah, I think there are probably going to be some tough moments this year, but there are also probably going to be some great ones. And, you look back at these last couple of years, there were some hard moments before there were some great moments.
Yeah.
That's just kind of how sports works, but that's also, you saw it firsthand with this women's basketball team. I mean, it wasn't like they flipped a switch and boom, they were ACC contenders. You got to build it a little bit. And I think it is interesting that Megan Duffy only added 1 player from the transfer portal.
Yes.
And that they only have 11 players on roster. I don't think that's going to be a problem. It is just interesting that, and one of the things she said was we kind of wanted to give opportunities to the kids, some of the kids that decided to stay that were already here, and build it like that, right? So instead of bringing in another transfer portal player or something like that, those minutes are going to somebody like Mackenzie Nelson, Samaya Suffren, building for the future. And I think that makes sense, right? Megan Duffy's a good coach. And we talked about the non-conference for the men. The women have a pretty good non-conference schedule too.
They do.
They've got Iowa. They've got that tournament in Fort Myers as well.
Go to Georgia.
They've got Georgia in the SEC ACC Challenge, and they've got a game against Rutgers, the return game from the last year's home and home here, right? So there will be opportunities to to kind of get a really, really good gauge of where they are. And it would not shock me if the Hokies take a handful or the majority of those games. It's just, I think in the big picture, like this will be a team maybe a little bit better than 500. But the tough part is it's like when you're in the ACC, I just worry that like the ACC schedule is going to be overwhelming at times, which is just the game, right?
The nature of the beast, yeah.
That's just that's
Same
a good
for
way to
everybody
put it.
else, too.
Yeah, and that's tough.
I think they'll take a scalp or two this year, but there'll also be moments where you're like, oh boy, we've got a ways to go a little bit.
Sure.
That's the way I look at it.
And to be clear, like I think the buy-in is not going to change. Like I think,
absolutely.
I think the support for Virginia Tech women's basketball is here to stay. I stuck around after the scrimmage the other day, and the scrimmage probably had 2,000 people there. Maybe
I think
2,000.
so, probably.
No, and if you remember, it was just a couple of years ago. They only averaged 1,500 in attendance for regular season games. So that's a good sign that even though Kenny Brooks left, the fan support is still there. Now you have to make sure that you show progress so they stay. Yeah,
and that's a credit to him and his staff too. But you look at after that scrimmage, there were still 15, 20 kids that were down by the tunnel after the game, waiting for autographs from Carly Wenzel, Matilda Ack, like that. I don't think that's going to change, which is very, very cool to see.
Yeah, I think this program means a lot to the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, that's something that a lot of people talk about, but you could see it over the last couple of years, especially last year, how much this team, this program coming out to these games meant for families. It's a Sunday afternoon thing. Hey, let's go to a Virginia Tech women's basketball game.
Yeah, it's a different crowd. You see, you see some of the same faces at men's and women's game, but you see a lot of faces at women's games that you don't see at men's game.
Totally agree.
Because the tickets were so cheap. People are like, well, I have a wife and 3 kids, and I can't afford to take them to every men's game, but I can afford to take them to every women's basketball game. Now, that said, didn't they double the ticket prices for women's hoops this year? So hopefully that still continues despite the price increase.
Yeah,
So.
But I think as far as like the community ties, I think Carter, you asked at the beginning about what this having a lot of this core in terms of the players returning means. It means they're familiar faces for the fans, and I think that's important.
Great way to put it.
So much of Virginia Tech's success in the community with the fans was because the players were so likable. The coaches were so likable. Everybody around it. You knew Elizabeth Kitley and Georgia Amore, and little kids felt comfortable going up and talking to them, right? And I think there are a lot of players on this roster who were around last year, and for the fans, seeing those familiar faces again, knowing, hey, like I've cheered on those kids before, right? I'm going to continue to. I think that's important. Like, I think it only helps.
Yeah. No doubt. Well, guys, I am still excited. We got basketball coming up on Monday. The men's side of things, I'm curious to see what this group looks like under Mike Young, and then Megan Duffy, brand new era. So 6 days from now, the men play host to Delaware State, and the women play host to UNCW. So between now and then, Chris, David, what is coming up basketball-wise on TechSideline.com?
David, you can answer that.
Yeah, it's all. I think it's all me. I'm going to write kind of a preview for each team these next 2 days, kind of going in a little bit in depth on, position by position. Hey, here's what to look for. Here's kind of my outlook on things. So, basketball season's here. I love it. I'm interested to see if both Virginia Tech teams can prove people wrong this year. I think that's the exciting part, is a little bit underdog mentality for both groups.
And you got football the rest of the week, I assume, right?
Oh, yeah. I'm still working on that Syracuse preview.
Syracuse preview podcast tomorrow, correct, on Wednesday?
That's right.
And then recap on Monday. So for Chris Coleman, David Cunningham, Nick Brown, I'm Carter Hill. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you very soon.